With over 2 billion followers, Islam stands as one of the most powerful and influential religions on earth, shaping cultures, laws, and identities across multiple continents. However, an unprecedented and historic transformation is quietly occurring beneath the surface of the modern world. It is not being driven by the violence of war, the maneuvering of geopolitics, or the force of military conquest, but by a mechanism far simpler, completely decentralized, and entirely unstoppable. Imagine a hypothetical morning in the near future, specifically March 27, 2035. The morning call to prayer that once echoed consistently and vibrantly through historic cities like Casablanca has fallen notably silent in many urban neighborhoods. Mosques that were once packed to capacity find themselves navigating changing attendance patterns, with some standing empty or being repurposed for secular community use. Islam, a faith that has rigorously shaped global civilizations for over 2,400 years, is experiencing an unprecedented internal reckoning, all catalyzed by something as seemingly innocent as a local Wi-Fi signal, a mere generation ago, suggesting that smartphones and digital connectivity would do more to challenge traditional religious authority than historic military conflicts would have been dismissed as completely delusional. Yet today, that precise scenario is unfolding across the globe, driven not by coercion, but through the quiet, relentless revolution of information access. To truly comprehend how this digital transformation occurred, why online connectivity became a unique vulnerability for dogmatic systems, and what this means for the future, we must examine a profound historical parallel. In 15th century Europe, a German innovator named Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, fundamentally altering the trajectory of human communication. Before this technological breakthrough, Christian clergy held a strict, unbroken monopoly on scriptural interpretation. The Church carefully controlled access to knowledge, maintaining the Bible almost exclusively in Latin, and effectively positioning the priesthood as the sole arbiters of salvation, truth, and morality. The introduction of the printing press abruptly shattered this centuries-old centralized control over human thought. As the Bible was rapidly translated into local, everyday vernaculars, ordinary people gained direct, unmediated access to the sacred texts for the very first time. Upon reading the scriptures independently, the public began discovering glaring contradictions, systemic institutional corruption, and ecclesiastical rules that did not align with the original teachings they were uncovering. Enter Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk whose famous 95 Theses fiercely criticized church corruption, particularly the transactional sale of papal indulgences. Armed with the printing press, Luther's revolutionary ideas spread like wildfire across Europe, making the traditional enforcement of uniform religious dogma completely impossible to maintain. This explosion of dissent birthed the Protestant Reformation, fracturing the clergy's exclusive claim to spiritual truth and propelling Western civilization toward individual interpretation and independent thought. The printing press effectively dismantled centuries of rigid religious control, initiating a slow but permanent institutional collapse. This shift paved the way for the Enlightenment, a transformative period when science, empirical philosophy, and secular reason began to take center stage over blind faith. Over the subsequent centuries, this trend snowballed into the deep-seated secularism observed today in countries like Sweden, France, and the UK, where active religious adherence sits at historic lows. For centuries, Islam appeared uniquely resilient to the types of secularization and internal fracturing that reshaped Western Christianity. Emerging in the 7th century through the revelations of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam established a cohesive framework that incorporated shared theological and narrative elements from Judaism and Christianity. However, unlike Western Christianity, which underwent centuries of painful, gradual adaptation to accommodate scientific breakthroughs like heliocentrism and evolutionary biology, traditional Islamic institutions maintained a remarkably tight grip on interpretation. This historical rigidity successfully preserved a powerful sense of uniformity across vast geographical empires, but it simultaneously created a deep structural vulnerability. Throughout history, any belief system that aggressively suppresses internal critique and adaptation becomes inherently fragile when it is suddenly exposed to an uncontrollable environment. In past eras, isolated dissenters or questioning minds simply lacked the global infrastructure required to connect, share their doubts, or build supportive alternative communities. The arrival of the internet completely upended that dynamic, introducing a borderless realm where any forbidden question can find an immediate voice. Statistical data from organizations like the Ex-Muslims of North America, EXMNA, reveals that an overwhelming majority of modern apostates cite online forums as the primary catalyst for their theological doubting. For individuals living in highly conservative societies where public dissent carries severe legal or social consequences, the internet completely shattered the terrifying illusion of isolation overnight. Traditional, centralized authority structures are now facing a crisis of legitimacy as the democratization of information accelerates. A tech-savvy 16-year-old in a remote region can now instantly challenge a complex fatwa issued by elite scholars, gathering substantial digital support in the process. Data from the Pew Research Center highlights this shift, indicating that religious disaffiliation rates among people raised Muslim in the United States now closely mirror the disaffiliation rates seen in American Christianity. Defenders of traditional religious structures frequently counter these observations by pointing to macro-demographic data showing that Islam remains the world's fastest-growing religion. While the raw global numbers are indeed increasing, sociologists emphasize that this growth is almost entirely birth rate-driven, heavily concentrated in developing nations with high fertility rates. These are also regions where female literacy, economic independence, and general access to modern education unfortunately remain alarmingly low. However, longitudinal demographic studies reveal that this momentum shifts rapidly when socioeconomic conditions and connectivity improve. When families migrate from high fertility developing regions to more secular Western societies, their birth rates drop precipitously within just 1 or 2 generations. In countries like Germany, France, and the United States, the fertility rates of integrated immigrant families quickly decline to match the national average of roughly 1.5 to 2.1 children per woman. This dramatic shift highlights the profound impact of female education and autonomy on traditional family structures. Global databases maintained by UNESCO demonstrate a direct mathematical correlation. For every additional year of higher education a woman receives, her average fertility rate drops significantly. Furthermore, World Bank analyses indicate that as per capita GDP rises in developing nations, traditional religious observance steadily decreases among the emerging professional classes, a trend currently visible among urban youth in wealthy Gulf states. Beyond birth rates, data regarding voluntary conversions highlight serious long-term retention challenges for traditional institutions. In Western nations, various demographic estimates suggest that a notable majority of individuals who voluntarily convert to Islam eventually choose to leave the faith entirely within a few years. This reality creates a complex demographic illusion, where the apparent growth of the faith is increasingly challenged by a rising tide of private and public disaffiliation. As the internet transforms Islam into a subject of global, uncensored public critique, a fascinating cultural defense mechanism has emerged. On platforms like TikTok, YouTube, and X, younger generations are openly debating controversial historical tenets that were once considered completely taboo. In response, many modern progressive believers and apologists have begun actively reinterpreting or downplaying the less savory aspects of religious history to make the faith more palatable to modern secular audiences. In trying to defend the faith against contemporary human rights critiques, these well-meaning advocates are effectively initiating an organic, bottom-up reformation. By insisting that traditional doctrines are inherently compatible with modern concepts of intersectional feminism, gender equality, and pluralism, they are rewriting the narrative. They are consciously or unconsciously shifting the religion away from its historical, classical interpretations and anchoring it in modern Western values. This inadvertent reformation is no longer merely theoretical. It is actively unfolding in real time across major metropolitan hubs like London, Berlin, and New York. The emergence of inclusive, LGBTQ-affirming spaces and the rising movement of female imams directly challenge centuries of strictly male-dominated religious leadership. Concurrently, systemic advocacy organizations like Musawa, are successfully utilizing these progressive rereadings of classic texts to lobby for tangible family law reforms in countries like Morocco and Tunisia. Furthermore, digital scholarship platforms welcoming historical critical approaches to sacred texts are experiencing a massive surge in traffic, drawing millions of monthly visitors from Muslim-majority countries. It is an evolutionary process that mirrors what occurred within Christianity over the last few centuries. Whether they realize it or not, the apologists asserting that the faith is inherently progressive are planting the seeds for a fundamentally altered, softer version of the religion. Ultimately, for any meaningful long-term intellectual transformation to take root, certain foundational conditions must be vigorously protected. Religious reformation and critical inquiry can only thrive in societies that uphold unconditional freedom of expression, protect individual dissent, and firmly resist the reintroduction of blasphemy regulations under the guise of hate speech. Without the protected right to question, criticize, and even mock historical dogmas, intellectual progress inevitably collapses. History may well record that the long-term evolution of Islam was not dictated by the sword of military conflict or the decrees of political regimes, but by the subtle, borderless flow of digital information. The Internet has become the ultimate equalizer of ideas, permanently dismantling the traditional relationship between institutional gatekeepers and the individual mind. As connectivity penetrates the furthest corners of the globe, the quiet revolution of information continues to reshape the landscape of faith in a connected world.